Hello and welcome to today's webinar on carbon footprint, the path towards net zero. My name is Aprajita Singh from BSI marketing team, and I'm here to facilitate this webinar. Before we start, I would like to give you some ground rules. You all have joined the webinar as on listen mode only, but please feel to type in your questions in the question box on the webinar control panel. Our speaker will do their best to answer as many questions at the end of the webinar. If due to the time limit, your questions are not answered, then we will provide them after this webinar. This session is being recorded and you will receive the recording shortly after this webinar along with the survey question form. I would like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Mr. Raghu Kumar, the Sustainability Head, BSI India. He is a postgraduate environmental engineer from IITM, having over 3 decades of experience in the field of environment, sustainability, academics, regulatory, consulting, auditing, and training. He was actively involved in the validation of 2400 megawatt gas-based power project of Reliance Industry, Samalkot, 340 megawatt and 155 megawatt gas-based combined cycle power project of ESA Group for first of its kind e-waste recycling project of Italo Recycling, 100 megawatt wind power project of TLF, carbon footprint verification of JK Tires and Adani Power, new CDM methodology, validation for Dow Chemicals, and etc. Before we start, we have a poll question for our audience. I would request our audience to kindly take part so that we can understand our participant profile. Please select one of the below answers.
Can we have the answers, please?
Thank you for participating in our first poll question. Now, to start this webinar, I would like to hand over to Mr. Raghu Kumar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Aprajita, and welcome you all to this webinar, Carbon Footprint, the Path Towards Net Zero. The agenda for this webinar is going to be the background. We'll quickly go into the background, the Global Risk Network, UN Sustainable Development Goals, COP26 commitments, trends in Indian corporates, carbon footprint, the drivers and standards related to that, I mean the 14,060 family, GHG inventory boundaries, sustainable value chains, carbon neutrality and past 2060, and circular economy. So to give you a very brief about the whole subject, I think everybody is now aware that climate change and carbon are the topics of the day. And world over, there is a lot of emphasis on these two areas. The World Economic Forum is publishing the results of Global Risk Perception Survey every year, wherein the respondents rank the most concerning risks globally and the drivers. If you see the report of 2021, it's evident that climate action failure ranks first in the risk, followed by infectious diseases, livelihood crisis, social cohesion erosion, etc., following subsequently. If you see that report of 2022, that again corroborates the fact that climate action failure is one of the major risks, followed by extreme weather, biodiversity loss, livelihood crisis, social cohesion, etc. And these actually contribute to the further risks of youth disillusionment, natural resource crisis, involuntary migration, environmental damage, extreme weather, livelihood crisis, climate action failure, and biodiversity loss. That means climate action failure is important, is very, very critical for business, and actions on this aspect is the requirement of the day. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, I think you must have seen that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015, provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and planet for now and in the future. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals calls for urgent action by all countries, developed as well as developing countries, in a global partnership with strategies to improve health, education, reduce inequality, spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and working towards preserving our oceans and forests. The UN conference that has happened in Glasgow, the COP26, brought together many leaders and delegates wherein they reaffirmed the Paris Agreement goal of limiting the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees centigrade. They also expressed alarm and utmost concern that the human activities caused around 1.1 degrees centigrade warming of the global temperature up to date, and the impacts are being felt everywhere. And in fact, we are also experiencing so many natural disasters that are happening around. And there is also depletion with respect to the carbon budgets that are available for the actions. They also recognize that impacts of climate change will be much lower at a temperature increase of 1.5 degrees compared to that of 2 degrees centigrade, which is happening now. That's why actions are important and actions are required to combat this climate change. Carbon neutrality, the concept of carbon neutrality was strengthened by the Paris Agreement, and the governments agreed to reduce the emissions and achieve a balance between emissions and removals in the second half of the century, which is the very definition of carbon neutrality. India is also committed to its own net zero emissions by 2070, and wherein our Prime Minister has declared a five-fold strategy, Panchamrita, to achieve this feat, wherein the points included: India will get its non-fossil energy capacity by 500 gigawatt by 2030, and India will meet 50% of its energy requirements from renewable energy by 2030, and a total projected carbon emissions reduce the emissions by 1 billion tons from now on till 2030. And by 2030, India will reduce the carbon intensity of its economy by 45%. Thereby, by 2070, India will achieve the target of net zero. The target is very ambitious, and it's not that ambitious alone, but then we are actually started taking actions. I think you must have seen that Prime Minister laid down a massive renewable energy project in Rajasthan, which is the combined of wind power and solar power. The sustainability strategy for organizations at the board level are now driven by stakeholder pressure, customer requirements, especially from financials, peer competition, operational efficiency, social license to operate, reputation, and brand image. If you see the Futurescape Responsible Business Ranking of 2021, manufacturing companies perform better than service companies. And if you see the top 10 that is covered in the list, a range of industries from IT, FMCG, chemicals, life sciences, textile, power, steel, and mining are there. And it's very interesting to note that all these 10 companies in the top list have mapped their business goals to sustainable development. Yes, DGs. So there is a trend. What we see in Indian corporates is there's an increasing focus on setting emission reductions and renewable energy targets. Regulations are continued to be perceived as a risk and an opportunity. It's not only as a risk, but also as an opportunity. Companies are increasingly looking to set internal price for carbon. Some of the companies have already set an internal price, like Infosys and all. They have already set an internal price for carbon as part of their mitigation measures. Increasing awareness on data quality and assurance, because whatever your going to declare in terms of the carbon footprint, the data quality is also very much important, and the assurance of that data is also important. And of course, there is an impetus on resource management. The Indian companies who are committed to carbon neutrality, I think I've listed some of the companies here, but then there are many who are already committed. The Tata, Ambuja Cements, Reliance, ArcelorMittal, Mahindra & Mahindra, Nippon Steel, ITC, ACC Cements, JSW Group, SR Oil, Adani Cements, Sun Pharma, Dalmia Cements, Vedanta, etc. So that shows that the focus is now on sustainable development and sustainable production and sustainable business. Now let's understand what is carbon footprint. Carbon footprint is the absolute sum of all emissions of greenhouse gases caused directly and indirectly by a subject, either over a defined period or in relation to a specified unit of product or instance of service, and calculated in accordance with the recognized methodology. That's important. We cannot do as per our own wish and will, but then it should be as per a recognized methodology. And carbon footprint of any entity is the measure of the greenhouse gas emitted due to the activities of that particular entity. The entity could be individuals, it can be families, it can be clubs, social groups, communities, organizations, or part of organizations or brands, regional or local governments, etc. The carbon footprint is expressed in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent, CO2 being the reference gas. Carbon footprint gives a measure of individuals' contribution to global warming or an entity's contribution towards global warming. This measure is important for reporting for compliance and reduce risk of energy security, stay ahead of regulation, identify hotspots to make carbon reductions. Once you know that the carbon footprint for your organization and what are the areas where you have the maximum carbon footprint, then you will be able to take some actions on those areas where there are possibilities of any reduction. Improve reputation, meet stakeholder and client demands, monitor regularly to track your own performance with respect to the carbon emissions, communicate to the outside world on your achievements. Basically, all this means data and data accuracy, right? So data accuracy is becoming much more important for your carbon footprint estimation. Carbon footprint analysis is a tool for sustainable development as well, because your sustainable development goals in terms of carbon or carbon emissions is to be demonstrated by your reduction strategies that you have and how much you have reduced. That way it is important. Now coming to the gases that are to be accounted for your carbon footprint. Initially we had 6 gases, which are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorinated compounds, sulfur hexafluoride. But then later IPCC has realized that nitrogen trifluoride also has a global warming potential compared to that of the other 6 gases. And now in 2019 version of the ISO 14064, it's also included as one of the gases to be accounted. So that means there can be expectation that more gases can be added to the list of the mandatory gases that need to be accounted for your carbon emissions calculation or your carbon footprint. The most popular standards for GHG accounting are the GHG protocol, which is by the WRI, that is World Research Institute, and World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And the other one is ISO 14064, which is by the ISO of the International Organization for Standardization. The most commonly used is the ISO standard, which is ISO 14464. The benefits of having a standard, why the standard is essential? Why not we do like as per the approved methodology and have our own way of doing it? But then a standard defines the boundary for clear definition of the boundary, clear definition of direct, energy indirect, and indirect emissions, to define your approach towards calculation and provide guidelines to choose the calculation method and the emission factors, because you may have to use various emission factors depending upon the type of emissions that you're using or the source of emissions, helping in designing information management systems, because the information management system is much more important, because your GHG calculations will be based on the data that you're going to collect and manage. A proper information management system is required for your data collection and data processing. Defining a report content. If there is no standard, then everyone will start doing in their own vision will. But then there may be mandatory requirements which may be missed out in the report, which will be a problem for the organization as well as for the verifying bodies. So a standard, an international standard, is very much helpful in this aspect to take into care of all these aspects and then guiding through a proper verification process as well. Yeah, now it's time for an interim poll. You may please answer this question. So you're all done. I think most of you said that it's important for your organization. Now, the ISO 14060 family of standards help enhance environmental integrity of GHG quantification, enhances the credibility and consistency and transparency of your GHG quantification, as well as monitoring, reporting, and verification of validation. And it facilitates development and implementation of GHG management strategies and plans, and also development and implementation of mitigation actions through emission reductions or removal enhancements. And it also facilitates ability to track performance and progress in the reduction of GHG emissions and or increase in the GHG removals. Now, all the GHG accounting follows the basic principles of relevance, completeness, consistency, accuracy, and transparency. For your GHG accounting process, the data that you have to be using should be relevant at the point in time of accounting, and the inventory that you have taken for the calculations should be complete, not with any incomplete inventory. Your approach that you're taking should be consistent across the periods. The accuracy with respect to the data that you are going to use for the calculations, and the transparency of the data, if at all you are using any emission factors, where from you got the emission factors or any secondary data used, where from those sources are, and that need to be transparent in the report, so that anybody who is wanting to check whether your calculations are right will be able to recalculate and see the calculations, and that ensures transparency in the whole exercise itself. Now, coming to the boundaries, when you do the GHG inventory, and you need to define the boundaries correctly, especially in terms of the organizational boundary and also the reporting boundary. The organization shall consolidate its facility level GHG emissions and removals by any of the following approaches. It can be through the control approach, or the equity share approach, or any approach as defined by the GHG program in which you are part of. In the control approach, it can be the financial control or the operational control in whatever style that the organization is. If it comes to reporting boundary, the reporting boundary, it's required that the organization has to establish and document its reporting boundaries, including identification of direct and indirect emissions and removals associated with the organization's operations. So by that way, we need to account for all the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, what we called earlier. But now, if you see the 14064 standard, the latest version 2019, these scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 are now re-nomenclatured as direct emissions, which are the scope 1 emissions, what we called earlier. Scope 2 emissions are now called indirect emissions from import of energy. Energy may be electricity, steam, heat, or cooling. And scope 3 emissions are divided into 4 categories. That is, indirect emissions from transportation, indirect emissions from product used by the organization, indirect emissions from the use of sold products from the organization, and indirect emissions from others, which cannot be included in the above 3 under the scope 3 what is classified. So this gives you an idea now the importance of the value chain, right? This gives you the importance of value chain, and that is why it's important that the value chain is also included in your JG exercise itself. The change in 2019 with respect to the 14064 standard is a response to a growing number of organizations recognizing the importance and significance of indirect emissions, and they are developing GHG inventories that include more types of indirect emissions across the value chain. Because some of the organizations, we have seen that they have calculated the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and the scope 3 emissions are becoming more than their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Especially this may happen in service sector. That's why when it comes to organization level GHG accounting, it is important that we also consider the value chain and then do the accounting accordingly without any omissions. The value chain, as per the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the value chains are an integral part of strategic planning for many businesses today. Right? So the value chain refers to the full cycle of a product or process, including the material sourcing, production, consumption, disposal, and recycling processes. That means you are considering end-to-end, cradle to grave approach, right? So at the upstream as well as downstream of your production, you may have the scope 3 emissions happening, and those scope 3 emissions are the indirect, whichever it is, indirect emissions may be for the use of product, the transportation, or the final disposal of the product, whatever it may be. Those need to be considered, and it's important. According to a study conducted by IIM Udaipur, they conducted a study with respect to the Indian companies, and they came out with an interesting report saying that 23% of the companies studied give specific targets to their suppliers to reduce their carbon footprint. And out of which only 24% of the companies conduct environmental audits of new suppliers. And some of the top scoring companies ensure that the suppliers meet the same environmental and social standards, including disclosure of goals and performance metrics. That means when you are committed to sustainable development and when you are committed to your various sustainable indicators, then you will pass it on to your value chain as well, so that overall for the organization, the carbon footprint is getting reduced. So that becomes imperative that institutionalizing sustainability in value chains is important. So a step-by-step approach may be required to do this. To start with, initiation of supply chain sustainability programs at the suppliers end, communication of your expectations to suppliers, initial assessment of the suppliers on the sustainability front to understand where they stand or to understand, helping to create processes and policies or frameworks for evaluation, because they may not be having the type of resource that you may be having. So probably a hand-holding will be required for you to support them and take them along your stride. Training for suppliers on the dimensions of sustainability. And of course, once you train and put them on track, then you need to monitor the evaluation, monitor and evaluate the suppliers on how they are performing with respect to what initiatives they are taken. So supply chain emissions becomes very, very important in our GHG accounting and your carbon footprint. The PAS 2060 standard, PAS means publicly available specification. The PAS 2060 was the first published standard with respect to carbon neutrality way back in 2010, and then it was updated in 2014 to address the inconsistencies in use of terminology in industry and publications. The development of the PAS 2060, in the development of PAS 2060, are involved the Eurostar, Marks and Spencers, the Cooperative Group, Carbon Trust, Aviva, Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, Department of Energy and Climate Change, and Association of British Certification Bodies. It's a conglomeration of people who work together to bring out this standard. Now, considering the importance, the success of PAS 2060 has also attracted the ISO, and the ISO Committee for Greenhouse Gas Management and Related Activities is now working on a standard which is 14068, which is expected to arrive late 22 or in early 2023. That may be much more descriptive than the PAS 2060, maybe, we don't know. Let's wait and see what's the change that they're looking for. So the carbon neutral is a condition in which during the specified period, there has been no net increase in the global emission of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere as a result of the greenhouse gas emissions to the subject during the same period, right? So that means your organization has emitted no more gases in the specified period than the previous one. That doesn't mean that you didn't emit greenhouse gases during the specific period. It means that the carbon footprint remains the same or neutral, right? Emitting no greenhouse gas or removing more greenhouse gas than you consume within a specified period is also possible. In that case, we'll call it as a condition of climate positive or zero carbon emissions. Whereas the net zero emissions for a company involves achieving a state in which its value chain results in no net accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere and no net impact from other greenhouse gas emissions. That means carbon neutrality is a state of being carbon neutral. Right? These are the terminologies that we are coming across in 2060. So let us be very clear on what they convey as a meaning. Now coming to what is the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. Though the difference is very subtle, people use it interchangeably many times. And when you see carbon neutral, it's a minimum requirement of covering scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions is required, and scope 3 is encouraged. Whereas in net zero, we must cover scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Carbon neutral, we have no requirement of a company to reduce its emissions on a certain trajectory in order to be carbon neutral. There is no minimum reduction specified. It's up to you to decide what is your reduction that you want to achieve. But in case of net zero, there must be a reduction in emissions along a 1.5 degrees centigrade trajectory across scopes 1, 2, and 3. Unless otherwise you qualify this, you may not be qualifying for calling yourself net zero. An organization may need to purchase carbon offsets that either result in carbon reductions or efficiency for sinks, and that they can offset it to become carbon neutral. But then if you want to be claiming net zero, it cannot be done, and you must ensure GHG removals that result in carbon emission reductions into the atmosphere to achieve the neutrality. That means you can't pay to pollute more. So these are the differences between the carbon neutral and net zero, which you have to be careful, because many times we interchangeably use this term. Now coming to the benefits of PAS 2060. The PAS 2060 standard help to combat climate change, enhance your sustainability credentials and your resilience, gaining competitive edge by offering customers greener products and services, and improving business efficiency by cutting energy cost, accurate and verifiable declarations on your carbon neutrality that are not misleading, and aligning with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the scope of PAS 2060 can be, it can be used by any entity, including regional and local government, communities, clubs, families, individuals, and also the activities what they do, or the service that they do, or the products that they produce, buildings, events, etc. Now, the way to achieve carbon neutrality is through reduction in direct GHG emissions or through offsets. The PAS 2060 does not make provision for a declaration of achievement of carbon neutrality only through offsetting, other than for the first application period. For the first application period, of course, it recognizes that you are the starting point, and there cannot be 100% actions on, to reduce, to bring down your emissions to the neutrality stage. But then it's definitely possible, or it can be planned in the next application period. So that's why 2060 allows you to offset your carbon emissions for demonstrating neutrality only for the first application period, and subsequent periods it is essential that we need to reduce in absolute terms a reduction in emission intensity, which will be evident for a defined subject. So unless otherwise that is complied, you cannot claim carbon neutral status. Now, the four-stage process to demonstrate carbon neutrality as per PAS 2060 are the assessment of GHG emissions based upon accurate measurement with data, reduction of emissions through a target-driven carbon management plan, offsetting excessive emissions, often by purchasing carbon credits. That if it is 2060 standard, then this is applicable only for the first application period. And then documentation and verification through a qualifying explanatory statement and public disclosures. The standard 2060 is very clearly stipulating what are the things that need to be there in the explanatory statement that we need to submit as part of the PAS 2060 requirement. And also, what is the public disclosure that you can have at the various stages of your path towards carbon neutrality, right? So we need to be careful in using the statements in terms of declarations that you're making it public, because it should not convey a wrong meaning to the people or the stakeholders who are seeing that. The 10-step process to begin with your PAS 2060 journey can be to undertake a carbon neutrality briefing, so to understand the requirements about carbon neutrality, consolidate need statement for pursuing, share your needs with your team and arrive at consensus on what will be the next step that you may have to do, draft your PAS 2060 scope and contact your verification body, maybe like BSI, to share your scope and objectives, and then conduct a gap analysis and supply readiness assessment to inform on the next steps, what you are going to do, and set out organization's journey and project plan to achieve carbon neutrality. You need to have a proper planning for achieving your carbon neutrality, and agree on the methodology to assess the carbon footprint, what methodology that you're going to use, and to establish your baseline data, because you need to establish the base data or a base year calculation need to be done, and begin to produce your carbon management plan, what you're going to do in the period that you are going to do the actions, what are the things that you're going to do as part of your mitigation actions or reduction actions. Reach a decision on the level of verification that you require, whether it's going to be a reasonable level of verification or a limited level of verification. So because the extent of data and the extent of accuracy of the data depends upon your the level of verification that you may require for your quantification. So that again depends upon what is the requirement from your whomsoever is requiring that verification to be done, or if it's your own, you may have to decide on what's the level of verification that we may have to do. But then it's always better to go in for a reasonable level of assurance, because that only will be more credible compared to that of a limited level. And the final step is to make your organization declarations to achieve carbon neutrality commitments within your management plan and within the defined period. I said 12 months here, but then it's up to you to decide within what period you may have to achieve. Now, the use of carbon and energy hierarchy may be helpful for your strategies for reduction of emissions. To avoid energy use wherever it can be avoided, reduce, that is, use less by smart design, more efficient equipment, less materials, etc. Switch to low carbon and renewable sources of energy materials, and offset, finally, when all this is done, offset the residual remaining emissions by maybe credits, what you buy from the carbon market. Now, with more companies stepping up into the climate change and setting targets and jump on the net zero bandwagon, circular economy strategies have been noticeably absent in most corporate climate change roadmaps, despite the intuitive link, because it's expected that there should be a strong action towards reduction of the emissions, in which the circular economy could help in a greater extent. However, nowadays we are starting to see a transition from a linear to a circular economy. Circular economy is a model of production and consumption which involves sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, and recycling existing materials and products as long as possible. Right? It can be, the approach can be a closed loop system, or it can be open loop system as described by the standard BSI 8000. We'll come to that later. But definitely, the circular economy will help you to improve your customer relationship, identify new sources of innovation and revenue, cost savings, improve resilience for organizations, preserve your natural capital, and enhance your climate change mitigation actions, growth and employment. Now, the principles of the BS 8001 standard, which is the framework for circular economy, is systems thinking, innovation, stewardship, collaboration, value optimization, and transparency. Right? Now, the framework for implementing the principles of circular economy in an organization, it involves an 8-step or 8-stage approach, which is starting with framing, wherein you assess the current state of play and relevance of circular economy for your organization, including your stakeholder mapping, generate internal awareness. And the second stage, that's the scoping stage, you identify the systems to be explored and influenced. And then you look for the new ideas, right? You look for a list of ideas where we can, and options for you to optimize on your, your actions, and then prioritize them accordingly based upon whatever constraints that you have. Then once the ideas are generated, study the feasibility of those ideas, then come up with the one which is the feasible for you. And then for the one that is selected as feasible, then you develop a business case. And once the business case is developed, then you go for piloting and prototyping. And once the piloting and prototyping is done, then you, in the delivery and implementation stage, you will develop and execute delivery plan for implementation and mechanisms to measure progress over time. And once that is done, you start doing it, and then monitor and measurement. You report on the progress, and that's how you do the continual and transformational improvement. That's how the circular economy framework is built in. It's an 8-stage process. Now, depending upon the level at which you are, or the level of maturity you are, the circular economy maturity can be level 0, which is unformed, which is the basic stage. That means you are only looking into the waste with respect to the regulations. Then the second phase is the level 1, which is the basic phase, wherein the initial framing and scoping is done and you're actively exploring opportunities. Level 2, which is the improving phase, wherein the process improvement is characterized by ways of working that align with circular economy principles, the principles whatever we see in the previous slide. And in the engage phase, to align the value proposition to your circular economic principles. And the last phase, that's optimizing phase, is where you reach your maturity level and you start doing things in the way that is required by the CE or the circular economy principles. Now, there are many standards which are in place now to support your climate change actions. Some of them are listed here. There are many. 14090, which is sorry, adaptation to climate change, the principles, requirements, and guidelines. 14097, which is the framework including principles and requirements for assessing and reporting investments and financing activities related to climate change. 14067, which is the carbon footprint of products, the requirements and guidelines for quantification. So the standards are there for you to help in aligning your actions, and so that you are doing all those things in an internationally acceptable way. There are many standards, the management system standards, which are available, which are also in support view of the UN SDGs. Some of them I listed and tried to map it to the 7 as well as the 12 SDG, energy management, carbon neutrality, environmental management systems, environmental management system life cycle assessment, adaptation to climate change, right? Sustainable procurement, circular economy, water efficiency management, water footprint, carbon footprint for products. So all these things are the standards which may be contributing towards affordable and clean energy as well as responsible production and consumption. Now, your BSI, your sustainability strategy can be supported by BSI in so many ways, in terms of your water management, in terms of your environmental management, energy management, carbon management, etc. And we do have the standards, various standards in place. And we, as BSI, as an organization, we do trainings at all levels, including the awareness trainings, implementation trainings, lead audit trainings, as well as we are actually also into, ETS, which is enterprise training solutions, which may be a hand-holding exercise for you, but at the same time, taking care that we are not actually involved in any sort of a consulting process, but then taking care of impartiality in our assessment process as well. So we can be rest assured for the services that we deliver in terms of sustainability. Your sustainability report assurance, in fact, BSI is also an approved partner for training in case of GRI, which is Global Reporting Initiative for Sustainable Reports, and we do sort of report assurance as well. So in establishing a roadmap, we can be of help to you, and we are ready with all the tools and techniques for you to help and take it forward. Now it's time for the third poll. Okay, thank you so much. Now, if you have, lead to Aparajita, please continue.
Yes, thank you so much, sir. I'm sure this was very insightful for our audience. And now we have a lot to whatever time permits us right now. Just let me give me a second. Okay, one gentleman asked, can we get the PDF of this presentation? Yes, you will be receiving the recording of this webinar shortly after. The second one is, as an IT company, how do you start with reducing the carbon footprint with dynamic work model? And do we need any practice, few aspects before going any such certification?
Yeah, to answer this question, see, now you are a service industry for that matter. I think that's what I was mentioning it. Unlike a manufacturing sector wherein the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are the ones which may be significant. But then I would strongly see that the scope 2 and the scope 3 emissions will be more relevant for you because you're not actually doing a manufacturing setup, right? And your scope 2, which is the electricity consumption, will be the one which will be contributing to your carbon footprint, plus the employee travel, right? The employee travel, you'll be traveling across, and also the other sub vendors from the vendor side also there will be a lot of emissions which will be there. So your focus should be more on your scope 2 and scope 3, unless otherwise you have some direct emissions based upon your maybe the support services that you have, which is under your control. But I see that most of the IT companies nowadays are on shared location, right? It's not under your control. It's controlled by somebody else. So in that case, that need to be taken care of. And what portion of the whole building or what portion of the total contribution because of the emissions from that particular campus is going to be attributed to you will be based upon the square feet that you occupied in that particular area. So there will be some calculations that have to be done, which can be taken definitely through, understanding the 14,064 standard requirements. In our trainings, we will discuss all that. There are a lot of software companies who have already gone in for this GHG accounting, and also we are they are also publishing the data in the sustainability report as well.
Okay, thank you, sir. The next question is, could you please advise what should an individual or consultant firm to equip either accreditations to report GHG emission for their own firm or other firms as business?
There is no accreditation required as such, right? It's that, you need to account your emissions. It's up to you to decide. There are some approved methodologies and approved practices that we may have to follow in your accounting. That may be done by your own internal team or maybe a consultant whom you may engage, right? There is no any approval or anything like that, but then the person who is going to be verifying, the verifying body should be a accredited body. That's enough, right? Finally, whatever statement that you are going to come up with on your declarations on your carbon footprint need to be verified for assurance of your claim that it is correct. A third-party assurance will be helpful in that aspect. It's up to you to decide to go in for a training, and if you feel that you can be competent for doing the GHG accounting, understand the principles and quantification methodologies, you are free to do it, and then come up for verification process.
Okay, thank you, sir. We have a question. It has 3 parts. The first part goes like, there are green auditors, carbon credit auditor, etc. are the profile in the certification field. Can you give a brief about the different profiles covering the carbon credit, GHG audit, green audit, etc.?
Yeah, see now, with respect to carbon footprint, see now the requirement is that you should be competent enough to do that job, and there are specific standards on what is the requirement for verification on validation bodies, right? So it should be an accredited body with respect to the accreditation boards, and to be an auditor for this particular scheme, you need to be having the qualification. Probably you may have to attend a training on this, then you may have to register with certification body, to get your practice on the GHG auditing itself before you will be sent out for as an auditor. You cannot be an independent organization who can be accredited for, individual that can be accredited for any accreditations like that. It should be you should be attached to a certification body, for which qualification you should also be attending the necessary trainings.
Okay, thank you, sir. The second part of this question was how to qualify yourself in this profile for green audit, carbon credit assessment.
To qualify yourself, that's what I told you. You may have to look in for the BSI's training schedule, or maybe any certification bodies who is offering this type of training. and then you get yourself successfully complete. After successful completion of the training, then you can approach any certification body for your enrollment with them to become auditor for greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes, thank you, sir. The third part was the same. Do you provide such trainings? So yes,
Yeah.
we can share you the training schedule and you can know the details.
Yes.
Other questions we have is, what is the benefit of implementing ISO 5001 and ISO 14064 or PAS 2060 together in the organization?
Okay, so now all these standards complement each other towards reduction of your carbon footprint, right? 50,001 is nothing but energy management. So when you're implementing energy management, one of the requirements from the energy management standard is that you need to demonstrate improvement on your energy consumption or energy intensity. That means you are supposed to reduce your energy consumption or specific energy consumption with respect to your production. In carbon footprinting, what you're doing, we are trying to mitigate your carbon emissions. And one of the sources of emissions here is your electricity consumption. So it's going to be having a direct relationship with your carbon footprint as well. So when you are reducing energy consumption, that means you are also reducing your carbon footprint. So that's a direct relationship that way. Now coming to, what's the next standard you told? 14,064, right? I mean 46,000.
Correct, sir. Yeah. Yes.
46,000 is water efficiency management. When you implement water efficiency management, you tend to reduce your your water consumption. You tend to reduce your water consumption, and that again is leading to reduced pumping, reduced transportation of water that you may otherwise buy from outside. If you are going to transport water from outside, you may be engaging lorries. More number of lorries means more number of diesel that is burned to transport the water. That means more number of emissions, more quantity of emissions from the transport. So when you reduce your emissions, whatever way you do, when it is accounting for reduction of your emissions, then it's again connected to your carbon footprint, right? So water conservation will also lead to reduction in your carbon footprint. That's how it is interrelated.
Thank you, sir. One more question. How do we estimate CO2 emission for activity scenarios where there are no established values or equivalents?
Nowadays, we are having values for everything. If you see the various websites, the published literature in terms of carbon field, the main document that we may have to refer is the IPCC document, which is actually the IPCC assessment reports are published now and then, wherein we have the emission factors for almost every activity. If not, you can always have other literatures that are available in terms of the government websites of DEFRA, Department of Forest, UK. It's a department of UK, which is the Forest and Health, which also publishes emission factors for various activities, including production, disposal, and even where it is getting disposed, depending upon where it is getting disposed, whether it is going for landfill, whether it is going to be burnt, or whether it is going to be recycled. They are having emission factors for everything. It's not that you will end up in a scenario where there is no such emission factors available for quantification. Only thing is we need to quantify how much is that what we are going to dispose. If that accounting is there, then the emission factors are available. Very rarely I have come across a situation where there is no emission factor for any such activity or sub-activity. Nowadays it's available. Earlier it was not there, but nowadays it's available. You can refer the IPCC literatures. IPCC is Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change.
Okay. So we have a long list of questions pending with us, but I guess due to the time limitation, we will take just one more. And rest of the questions would be answered to you through the email. So
Yeah, sure.
really sorry. Yeah, for not answering all the questions. So the last question would be, currently, are you reporting on the sustainability data, including emission data, to your corporate team?
Yeah, it's actually a question to you. You see, now what happens is, many of the organizations, what happens is the corporate is somewhere else, and they request the subsidiary companies here in the various countries to submit their emission data or the sustainability data, and most of them will also be submitting, but then they may not be understanding for what reason they are sending it, and at the end of the day, where it is reaching and for what purpose it is getting used, right? It's very, very important that, as we discussed in our previous slides, the accuracy of data is important for the JG quantification. So unless you know for what purpose it is getting used and then how it is getting calculated and then quantified in terms of declaration with respect to an organization's achievement, the data accuracy becomes critical. So if there is any error in the data, that will adversely affect the reputation of the organization itself. So it's important that when you declare something on sustainable data to your corporate, it should be very clear that it's going into your either sustainability report or into some of the commitments which your organization made as part of some regulatory requirements. That's the thing that you need to be taking care of.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for today's webinar. And I would also like to tell you that many of our viewers have told us that this you have explained perfectly well. So I guess this brings us to the end of the webinar, and we will answer as many questions which are not answered through the mail, and you will also receive a survey